Are you ready for an open discussion with the best of the best and the best of what's next? Welcome to the Tony DUrso Show. Join in on a great conversation today with some of the world's great influencers as they showcase great advice and techniques that made them the game changers they are today. Now, here's Tony DUrso.
Welcome. Thanks for hanging out with us today. We're going to chat with several gentlemen at the top of their category, the lead entrepreneurs. We're going to discuss Lead with a Story with Paul Smith and Kenny Tedford. Now, learning lessons can go over our heads sometimes. There's a lot to learn, isn't there? And you know, we simply cannot remember all the rules we've learned in our educational years or even after. Can you remember all the rules you've read in all the books over the years? There's a lot to it. Now, a great way, and perhaps the best way to learn and to have it stick is when there is a story attached to it. Today's interview is very unique as Paul is a storyteller, and after meeting Kenny, he wrote a book about him. And Kenny is amazing at telling stories, as you're going to hear in just a few moments. Now, if you're a leader or a salesman or a manager or a marketer, that means everybody, this is going to help you get your point across and remember. And by the way, while we're at it, this is all about helping you and your friends turn your vision into reality. Meet Paul Smith and Kenny Tedford. Paul has written a number of books on storytelling to help managers, leaders, and salespeople. And Kenny is an amazing storyteller and has some great life lessons worth repeating. And for those listening on audio, the subtitle on one of the books about Kenny describes him in this way. It says, "Life through the eyes of a child, trapped in a partially blind and deaf man's body." I'm going to let them tell you more about it. Let's bring them on. Hi, Paul and Kenny. Welcome to the Tony DUrso Show.
Hello, how you doing?
Hey, Tony, thanks for having us on.
It's such a pleasure to have you. I'm really looking forward to discussing Lead with the Story and all the nuances that go with it. There's a lot to learn here, as I've just said in the little intro. So first, let's introduce our audience just a little bit more. Perhaps, Paul, tell us just a little bit about I've talked a little bit about your backstory, that you're a storyteller, maybe a little bit about that and how perhaps you've run into and met with Kenny.
Yeah, thanks. So I spent most of my career in pretty typical corporate career type jobs, a couple of years at Accenture and 20 years at the Procter & Gamble company in various levels of management. But along that way, I just got fascinated with this concept of storytelling and wanted to know more about it and use it to be a better leader myself. And I read all the books I could find on the topic and still didn't know how to do it very well. And so I started interviewing leaders that I admired the most, who I thought were particularly good at it, first inside the company, but then outside the company. And at this point, I think I've probably interviewed 300 or so CEOs, executives, leaders, salespeople, et cetera. And that research is what became the content of the books that I wrote on the topic. The first one being Lead with a Story that you mentioned. But as I was out kind of evangelizing this concept of storytelling, I was speaking at a national storytelling convention at one point about that topic, about that book that had just come out. And I met Kenny Tedford. He was also speaking at the same event on a different stage at the same time that I was. So we didn't know each other, hadn't met, but we ended up sitting next to each other a few hours later at somebody else's performance, and not knowing that we were, performers on a stage ourselves just a few moments earlier. Just struck up a great friendship, and that led to us writing together the book 4 Days with Kenny Tedford. Which is not only the kind of a chronicle of his life and his life lessons, but me and my family's reaction to hearing his life story in those 4 days at my house. So that's what brought us together and started off this project called 4 Days with Kenny Tedford.
Now we're going to bring Kenny on in just a moment, but I'm very intrigued. What was it when you sat there and you just met him at the speeches you were doing? What was it about Kenny that made you decide to write a book about him?
Well, after we met, well, first of all, I thought it was just pretty bold for here's a deaf guy at a 3-day storytelling festival. I thought, it's pretty courageous. I want to meet this guy. And so we ended up having lunch together that day. And over lunch, he just started telling me his life story, which was just fascinating. And I had just signed a contract to write my second book at the time, which is called Parenting with a Story. And when I decided, it's time to start researching that book, Kenny's the first person I thought of. Yeah, this guy's got to have some great life lessons. Let me call him, the guy I met at that storytelling festival. And as I was interviewing him over an hour, and I recorded the conversation, at about minute 36, I asked him this question. I was like, Kenny, these are all like fascinating stories. I just need one of them for my book, but like you could fill up a whole book with all these stories. Have you ever thought about writing a book? And he said, well, yeah, I'd love to. And my audience members always ask me for it, but writing is just one of the challenges that I have. I just can't do it very well. And that's when I said the thing that probably surprised me as much as it did him. I said, well, you know what, Kenny, I'll do it. I'll write your book. And that was the thing, now I've committed to it, and it took a number of years, but we eventually got through it.
Kenny, what did you think when Paul was telling you about what he does, that he writes books, and then all of a sudden he drops it on you? He wants to write a book about you.
Well, to be honest with you, when I first met Paul, and he said he would like to write a book about my life, I've been told that by people before, and it just never, succeeded. And so he told me, and I just thought, hey, great, it'd be great if we can do it. But in my mind, I thought, well, here's another person making promises, and I know he lives in Ohio, I'm in Tennessee, and, I don't see how this is going to work. And, but I was honored that he was willing to do it. And then, of course, I found out when I came home, I Googled him, or whatever y'all call it, check on his background and, his book. And I thought, why is he, and I did the same, why is he writing about me? All his book is on business. Then it hit me about what I do when I go speaking in the past before I ever met Paul. I do a lot of conventions, doctors and nurses and businesses. I talk about the population out there that are disability, like what I call my group of people. And I was a job coach for 20-some years for people with disability and helped a lot of business to look in that area of a population that nobody seems to market. And so Paul and I kept talking back and forth, FaceTime, because at that time I never heard of Zoom. And before you knew it, I was in his house and spent 4 days with his family. So it was a dream come true.
I can imagine the excitement. And while the book was happening, while it was being written, did you have any aspirations of what you felt that people would get out of the book and how it would help them?
You asking me?
Yes, Kenny, okay. Yes.
Oh, okay. I thought you went to Paul. Yeah, all my life, even my parents, before they passed away, I've been told by teachers and even strangers at Walmart, restaurant manager, waitress, I got a big voice because I'm deaf and I talk loud. That's when I get excited. So there would be people sitting behind me at the restaurant, come around and just say, like, can I have a hug? I love that story about you. Oh my God. I'm like, and then she'll leave. And I gave her a hug and I looked at my friends at the table and I said, why do people keep doing that to me? It's embarrassing. He goes, because you're hilarious. That story you told, she needed to hear that. So I realized growing up, I've been wanting to do a book for 35 years. I mean, I was already doing performance at conventions, big conventions, as a performer, motivational speaker. And, but nothing, a book never came out of it. It was just me doing it, did my thing. And I loved it. I love traveling. So I'll come home and, go back to my regular 8-to-5 job as a job coach and working with people. And I became a director for 6 years with the governor. And so that was a beautiful job and never dreamed that would ever happen. And then because of that, then I got a master in storytelling in Johnson City. And so because of the master program, I went to this conference to be a keynote speaker, telling my cancer story. And then I just, as a faithful man, God brought it to happen. And I met Paul, he sat next to me, and we got to know each other.
That's amazing, Kenny. And for our audience, we're going to get into some of Kenny's stories in just a moment. Just a few more questions to kind of set the stage, and then we're going to go into a little bit of storytelling so that you can see a little bit more of what we're talking about. One of the things I'd like to know, Paul, is how long did it take to write this story? And there has to be some challenges. I mean, first of all, you both live quite a distance away from each other. And to me, I think it's a very unique, different book. Maybe there's a few questions there. Can you kind of take it from there and tell us about it?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, it was several years in the making because, yeah, there were more difficulties than you would have, normally. Normally, when I interview people, I just call them on the phone and have a conversation. Well, you can't do that when you're interviewing a deaf person. And back then, the technology, wasn't quite as good as, we're using right now. And so we tried as best we could to have in-person interviews. So that those first 4 days he spent at my house was certainly a large part of the interviews, but that wasn't enough. We had maybe a half a dozen or more, probably more different times where I would interview him. And so sometimes I would drive to Tennessee, and sometimes he would come here, and sometimes we'd meet in the middle. And there were times there where he was visiting a friend of his in Baltimore, and I would fly and meet them there. And we stayed at his house for a couple of days. So there were multiple times where I interviewed him over the course of several years. But then there was all the typical challenges of, finding a publisher. I mean, this wasn't a typical book, and certainly wasn't the kind of book that I typically write. So, my publisher at the time was the American Management Association, which now is part of HarperCollins. This is just not the kind of book that's in their wheelhouse, so they had no interest in it. And so it took me a lot longer than usual to find an agent and find a publisher. And so it definitely took longer than I thought. Plus, I had other commitments, with other books I was writing. But it eventually all came together. And I appreciate Kenny's patience and all that. We finally got it across the finish line. Unfortunately, literally right as the COVID pandemic hit, we literally, the book launched, and then we went out on book tour in March of 2020. So if you remember, that literally was right before everything stopped. And I think we had a 5 or 6 state, 9 or 10 city book tour through the South, and just finished in Dallas, Texas, I think, or Little Rock, and then back to Cincinnati. And a week later, everything got shut down. So we just got the book tour done, and then unfortunately, kind of everything came to a halt.
That is quite an amazing story, just in time. And as I understand it, Paul, the book it does have, or perhaps grammatically it includes, or it's part of it is about Kenny's life, but there's a lot more to it. And I think there were lessons that you got, as well as your family, in writing the book. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I started this as just an idea to write a biography of Kenny Tedford, this amazing man. And then it was, well, let me write it in first person. I'll just help Kenny, through his own voice. I'll interview him, and I'll write his story, in first person, so that it's really Kenny's book. And then in talking with our publisher, we decided to kind of do a little bit of both. And it ended up being a project that's kind of like that book, Tuesdays with Morrie, if you'll remember that. I think they made that into a movie, but it became a memoir of the time that Kenny and I spent together interviewing him. So it's written in my voice and his voice. It's me asking questions like you're asking us questions now, and then me writing the answers that he's giving me, telling me the stories of his life. But imagine that my wife and kids are like over my shoulder, like, these little puppy dogs, just, listening to these stories, just mesmerized, while I'm like madly typing away and trying to record everything. My wife and kids are listening to these stories. And so the book became, not just Kenny's stories, but me and my wife and kids reflecting on what he's telling us and the impact that it's having on us, me as a husband, as a father, my wife as a wife and a mother, and, how it's impacting our kids. And so it kind of goes back and forth between me asking a question and Kenny telling one of his life stories, and then the rest of us trying to figure out the life lessons that we can draw from that. So we try to summarize, some of those lessons at the end, but mostly you just go through Kenny's life and just learn from the wisdom of it all.
We're talking about Lead with a Story with Paul Smith and Kenny Tedford, and you can find more of the books. You can find out the books that we're talking about. You can find out more about Paul and Kenny at leadwithastory.com. That's LEADWITH, the letter A, STORY, leadwithastory.com. Kenny, I want to get into some storytelling here. Can you tell us about the day you were born?
Well, that was interesting. That's how life began. My parents were visiting my father's sister, which is my aunt. I was raised in Dallas, but at this time, they were on vacation visiting his sister and Jesse and Memphis. And somehow my mother was already 7 months pregnant, and that was with me. And for some reason, she found on a flight of steps on the front porch, I believe. And I can't say it right, but the biblical quote, whatever you call it, went around my neck and strangled me. And I had lots of oxygen. She went into a lot of pain, and they rushed her to the hospital. And they had to do that, cut her belly open, whatever it is, and, and pull me out. Then incubator. I was born 2 months early. But I was born with lack of oxygen, so I had brain damage, legally blind in my left eye, paralysis on my whole left side of my body. I can feel, but not very much. Sometimes I see it as a blessing when my girlfriend gets mad at my church. She slapped me on the right side, not the left side. Slapped me on the left side, not on the right side. And then when my papa give me a whipping, pop on the butt, I turn my butt around to the left side, and Daddy goes, no. I know you don't have feelings, so he'll give me, and I get the whipping, and again, I grew up with. I'm legally deaf. When I was born, I was totally deaf in my left ear, hard of hearing in my right ear, and then my mother, like I said, I was the seventh child. She had 9 children, and I was the only one born with a disability. And so after a few months later, we went back home. My father worked for the railroad. We took the train. Back in those days, it was so much fun riding the train. We rode the train from Memphis back to Dallas. And Dallas was a very famous hub at the time for the railroad. And so that's where I was raised at that time. And then when I was 8, around Christmas, my father died. I had a massive heart attack a week before Christmas. And then 5 months later, my mother died. And then we went to live with my aunt that I mentioned earlier, my father's sister. So we left Dallas and went to live with them. And so it was an amazing journey. It was too much. A lot of it still was innocent because I didn't understand the language of being deaf. The family didn't really speak to me much. And I did not know how to read lip at that time. And nobody really looked at me, and directly, and so that was basically what my life was like. It was just alone, but I wasn't lonely. I was blessed with love. My father, if you buy the book, there's so many stories in there about my father and some story about my mom, but I give credit a great deal to my father for toughing me up, and he even told me when I was little, before he died, that I would be bullied and made fun of, because at that time I was labeled retarded, and I was born in the very early 50s, and that's just the way it is. You're deaf or hard of hearing, you speak funny, you're labeled. You're labeled retarded in mentally challenged class, but back then it was called retarded. So my first 2 years in school, in public school with other kids, I was labeled retarded. But there's some really amazing stories, humor, how all that came about, but I don't think that really affected me for many years.
Kenny, I've interviewed a lot of people. I've run into a lot of stories about adversity, being bankrupt, living on the streets, coming back. Your story is amazing with what you've had to deal with. And for my audience, I'd like you to pay particular attention to this question. As I understand it, Kenny was told he would never finish the 3rd grade. You've just heard some of the adversities that he had to deal with in growing up and living with this, I guess we call it a disability, if that's the protocol and okay to say that there are these disabilities. And yet you ended up with a master's degree,
Yes, yes. That was never part of my plan. I never even thought I ever, again, I didn't think I was going to pass the third grade because I was told directly by the teachers and the principals that I would never pass the third grade. I would like to share one thing that stayed with me to this day, and it will to the end of my time. My grandmother told me years later, as I was becoming a teenager, I kind of felt a lot of the stuff being called retarded and being different and label, it did affect me. I mean, it gave me low self-esteem. And I was slow because, that I had the mental capacity of, I don't read well, understand things. But my grandmother told me the story when you asked me about when I was born. I love the story myself, but back then the family were not allowed to go into the mother when she's having the babies. Nobody's really allowed in there at that time. And my father would be in the waiting room, and everybody be passing out cigars. And I never understood that as a kid. Because what if you don't smoke a cigar? What did they give you? A cigarette or what? A pipe? What? And so my grandmother, that's her son, my father's mother. And she had shared with me because I told her one time I felt ashamed because they had me, a disabled son. And my grandma, to talk like that, let me tell you what your father did. And so the doctor, a doctor will come in and say, I'm proud to tell you have a 5-pound baby boy, baby girl. And everybody, and all the men start hugging each other, passing out cigars. But the doctor came in, and my father was in the waiting room, and he came up to my father, was really sad. That's where it all began. The words we say are very powerful. It's like a blade, you can destroy a person's life with a word. But the doctor came in really sad, and he looked at my father and said, I'm sorry to tell you, but you have a retarded baby boy. He's going to have a lot of he's born with brain damage, and he has other health issues. And my father just looked directly at me now, and he got a little closer to the doctor, and he goes, say that again. He goes, you have a beautiful baby boy. He's going to be fine. We're going to deal with the problems later. It's nice to meet you, Mr. Tedford. And then he just left. And then my father passed out cigars. So that's how my dad was. He never looked down on me ever once. Of my time while he was on Earth.
I love it. Editor, please pause this. Kenny, what I'm going to do is I'm going to mute you. And then I'm going to ask you if you would stand up and close the blinds because the sun's coming higher and it's washing out your video a little bit. And meanwhile, okay, I'll ask Paul a question, but I'm going to mute you. When I come back to ask you a question, I will unmute you. That way, the sounds you make, you understand?
No problem.
Okay, great. So I'm going to mute you and then I'm going to talk to Paul.
Great.
Very fascinating, Kenny story, and I can't wait to get back to some more of those. Those are quite something, full of adversity and just making things happen. And Paul, what I'd like to ask you about is, in the book, the last chapter, as I understand it, it has some lessons that have been learned. We've talked a little bit about this, and I'd like to ask if you can share some of those lessons with us.
Yeah, so, for example, we have a set of life lessons for everybody, but there are also some lessons there for people in the business world. And since it sounds like that's who your audience is, maybe I would focus on that a little bit. But probably these could be used for anybody. For example, one of the things that we learned, my wife and I learned when Kenny was visiting us, is that we all have disabilities of some kind, all of us. And Kenny's visit really made that obvious to us. And so it made other people's disabilities less disabling, I guess I would say. In fact, so when Kenny was when we were planning the trip, I know that my wife was a little concerned about him coming to our house and spending 4 days because she was worried that she wouldn't be able to make him comfortable in our home because she wasn't familiar with all of his challenges. And he can't hear very well, and he can't maybe speak very well, and he has trouble moving around, and will he be able to get up and down the stairs? And she was just very worried that she wouldn't be able to make him comfortable in our home. And then after 4 days, she said to me, I was all worried about I was worried about Kenny's disabilities, but it turns out Kenny wasn't worried about Kenny's disabilities. He lives with them every day and gets along just fine. So then she said, so now I've stopped worrying about them. And so, everything is fine. And as we talked about that, we realized, yeah, we all have some disabilities that we learn to live with. For example, I am terrible at directions. Like, I mean, I literally, Tony, I've gotten lost in my own neighborhood more than once. Okay. So our kids have learned, if you want to get directions on where to go something, do not ask dad, right? Go ask mom. And, my wife, bless her heart, math is just not her strong suit. And so our kids have learned, if they have a math problem, go ask dad, but yet, so those are our disabilities. So we all have our own disabilities and our own superpowers. And it's not just that, oh, well, Kenny has disabilities and we don't. No, that's not true. We've all got things that we're good at and things that we're lousy at. And once you recognize that, Kenny's not that different than we are.
Paul, that's really interesting. I just have to comment that my wife is like that with directions. She just has to go to one place, one time, and it doesn't matter where in the world it is. She can find her way to that place again. And she's done it in our world travels over and over again. As she says all the time, she has a compass in her head. So it is true that some of us are good at some things, and totally get it. Totally get it. Me, I can guess a number immediately and always be very accurate, no matter what the equation is. It's just absolutely amazing I can do that. There's 3 of us here today. I'm just teasing. Another thing I wanted to ask Paul is leadership. There's leadership lessons learned from this. I think you've even written a book on leadership, but you've learned some amazing leadership points in your dealings with Kenny, and I'd love for you to share some of those with us, Paul.
Yeah, so one of them is just a heightened sense of people who have different challenges, and how you can help them be successful in the workplace. And one of the things that made me realize is in my time with P&G, I recognized I worked on our diaper business for a while, Pampers and Loves diapers. And we got a new president of that business unit at one point. And she had been challenging our packaging and why our packaging looked the same. And specifically, she was complaining about the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, thumb-sucking baby boy that was on the cover of the package. And she said, like, why do all the babies on our package have to look the same? Aren't there any girl babies that we, aren't there any Hispanic babies? Aren't there any African-American babies that use our product? Why do they all have to look the same? And, several of the men on the team, complained, look, we've changed our packaging so many times. It's always a hassle. It's just fine. And she finally just yelled at them. It's like, why do all these babies have to look like you, Bob? And it finally got through to everybody that, we need to be more reflective of all of our consumers. And it took somebody to kind of shake us a little bit. And it didn't hurt that it was the boss, but it kind of shook us out of that. And just spending time with Kenny shakes me out of a lot of those things that are on autopilot that I hadn't thought of before. And I think some of those kind of ideas will come to you as you go through the book. You'll be shaken out of your autopilot.
I like that a lot, and I encourage everyone to check out the book. There are gems in these books, and that will help you in your business. They'll help you in your enterprise that you're building and everything. Kenny, I want to ask you a question along the same lines of leadership. I want to ask you for some stories, but I'd love to know, have you learned, or maybe that's not the right way to say it, what have you learned in the way of leadership from your association with Paul and writing the book?
To keep looking straight ahead. I mean, plan ahead, but at the same time, don't let other little things turn you into another direction, because you keep going in different directions, you're going to get dizzy. So I've learned that a lot from Paul, being, really direct and being me. As a leader, I always try to set an example. I don't care if a person 5 years old, if somebody 12 years old, 18, 25, 30, all the way up to 80, 90. I always be me. I'm not just going to be Kenny. And I don't know who else to be. So in leadership, if you have faith in other people, and you believe in yourself, and then they have ideas, you listen, as people have done with me. And so I try to inspire other people because I have been put down more than I want to imagine. So all the time I've been called names, worthless and never going to make past the third grade. I still believe in me, though. I had to learn the difference in meaning of what people were talking to me, but most all my life that I can even remember when I was 6 or 7, when I talk or tell a story of something, even talk about my mama making breakfast, everybody around me, strangers in my own family, even classmates, would just laugh. They'd just be laughing. Oh my God, that's so funny, Kenny. You need to be a comedian. And I'm like, I never understood it because I got two worlds in my front of me. One is I'm retarded, no good, worthless, you're never going to pass the third grade. You talk funny, you talk too loud, or your speech is horrible. And then they turn around and say, you need to be a comedian. You need to tell stories. And I really thought most of my life, I thought, there's no way. I mean, how can a guy like me, that's not very smart and has a speech problem and came here, I'm slow at learning words, but, even I fooled myself and found out every time I look in the mirror, I'm me. And I have been taught by different groups, teachers, counselors, even psychiatrists. I've dealt with depression, low self-esteem, and I've taught counselors, psychiatrists, I'm not ashamed of it. Mental health is a very personal thing with everybody. I think you may know more about my mental illness because that's my icon is per se. I don't know what y'all say, personality, whatever. Like Paul was with me, God be with Paul. He spent 10 days in the car. I spent days with him in an electric car. And so, I was learning that we were no different. When I first met Paul, he wanted to do the book. I thought, this guy is a big shot. He got 4 books out there. He worked for Procter & Gamble, vice president. I don't know what I think they was his title, I don't know, but he was a big dog, and he's going to go write a book about this little guy. So it was beautiful. Great friendship came out of this. And so I've been blessed. And so I hope I answered your question. But that's what I see as leadership, is to be open-minded, because people meet other people. I went to Gallaudet University to learn sign language. I love signing. I'll be honest, I like signing. So like what we're doing now, I have the headphones on, and I'm doing my best to read your lips. I hear you talking, but if I take off my headphones and you talk, I got to do better. I got to get really close to the screen. And so every deaf person is an individual. Every disability person is an individual. We're not all the same. Somebody here that Kenny's deaf. He's born with brain damage. He's legally blind. He's left eye. He got paralysis over here. If you read the book, there's a lot of other issues I've gone through, And before you meet me, you already make a decision. Oh my God, like Paul. No offense, but Paul, his family, his wife, he's not the only one. Even today, I'm almost 70 years old in a year. And people will be like, oh my God, can you come over for dinner? How do we communicate? I don't know how to sign, make sure we have enough pen and pencils at the table. And I'm like, what? Get to know Kenny. Come on, get to know me first. But the fear that everybody's learning from the world, and that's what Paul, I'm sure a lot of people have that growing up, oh my God, don't stare at that handicap. Oops, don't stare at that person that's blind. Oh my God, why are you touching that wheelchair? And so we are the best educator in the world, people with disabilities. and we're all individual and be treated like an individual. So leadership is taking yourself and just be you, but still learn. Like now I'm learning how to be a senior citizen. I'm loving it. I mean, I get to add that to my joie, or whatever you'll call it. Now I'm a senior citizen, and so I'm loving it because now people are treating me like an old man. And then when I tell somebody 2 weeks ago, I went to Walmart and the woman wasn't looking at me directly, but she was not saying things to me nice, I'm sure, like, how are you? Beautiful day. I said, I'm sorry, excuse me, but I have to read lips, I'm deaf. And she just went, oh my God, I'm so sorry. And then she came around the counter and said, can I have a hug? Because I'm deaf. She goes, I insulted you. How? And I can't grasp it. So I went and gave her a hug. And so my point I'm trying to say is what we hear from everybody else. And I tell people, get to meet the person first. Don't judge them. I mean, we're judging other people if we get to meet them. And like Paul was freaking out, gets his wife too, going down the steps, because I love telling the story. And people, first time I saw Paul, people say, hey, how was your visit with Paul? Do y'all do good right on the book? I said, you know what? And I, at the comedy and humor, I said, do you know where Paul and his wife put me in the house? No, in the basement. That's where they kept the dog, And so my friends go, he did. And then see, automatically, I got him thinking negative of Paul. But even though I was just playing, and I got, get a life. I said, I chose the basement because you had the recliner down there. I don't like sleeping in bed. And so it was beautiful. So I'm so grateful that Paul and his family, especially his boys, his youngest boy was, both of them have really learned a lot of things. So that's what I love doing with my book, is that get to know me, get to know you, get to know Paul. And so each one of us has our own gift to give to others, and we all have stories to tell.
I absolutely love that. We have a few minutes here. Can I get one story, Kenny, on one of your favorite stories from the book? You've told a couple stories. Can I get one more, and then we'll ask Paul for his favorite story?
So many. Okay, I think one of the very popular.
I could go. I was going to say I can go through your book and ask you something from it. But
I got a story I could tell you. Since you're talking about leadership, I'm going to share something with you. When we think of other people being different, then it's very powerful for me. I worked for Dolly Parton. I worked for Dollywood as a street character for 2 years. And it was a part-time job. And the other part-time job, I worked at McDonald's in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. And I worked at McDonald's in the morning when it opened, 6 a.m. Or 5 a.m. We had to get in early and clean up, get ready, clean up the parking lot. And that was my job. And I was kind of in those days, if you tell people, I still to this day don't understand it, but way many years ago, I was middle-aged maybe. I love working with Dolly. Oh, Dollywood, she's a doll. She's a wonderful woman and a wonderful lady. And so I work in the morning from 6 till noon, had my lunch because it was free, McDonald's. And then I went to work for Dollywood and became a street character. I was a different character every season and welcome mostly people with disabilities. That was my job, to make people in wheelchairs, those that are blind, go talk to them when they come in. Ignore the hearing people and the normal people. We're normal. We're the best people to have, okay? So people around me, I go to party. I was in high school. I do remember I was in high school. I think I was in high school. Church, I take that back, involved with church. And when we all get together and go to bowling, we go to party, Christmas party, people say, hey, Kenny, where do you work? And I said, well, I work, before I could even say Dollywood, I said, I work at McDonald's. And they're going, oh, look, Janet wants to talk to me, not talking to you. And they go to another little crowd. And I'm going, is something wrong with McDonald's? And then I hear somebody in the crowd say, to ask Jim, hey, Jim, where do you work? I work for Wendy's. She go, oh, I love the little square hamburger. Oh my gosh, it's so good. And they're chili. And I'm going, what in the world is wrong with McDonald's? They're the most largest in the world, and they give more money to kids with disability. They have these houses they provide for families for kids with cancer. And it's like you're supposed to be ashamed to be working at McDonald's. And so that started sipping in like a disease. You know, it goes in my pores. And so I kept hearing that for several months. And I thought, oh, I can't do this anymore. So I went and asked my boss for a bigger hat, like a baseball cap. And he goes, why? My head bloated. It's gotten fat, so I need a big hat. He goes, okay. So the real reason I wanted it, because I can pull it down and have it throw down into my eyes. Because friends were still coming to that McDonald's to get hamburgers and stuff before they go to Dollywood. And I didn't want them to know I was working there. Oh. So one day I was cleaning the table, and this Black man, African-American, was sitting there, an older man, and it was like in his 70s or 80s. And I had my head down. I was doing the thing. And then he looked at me. He said, can I see your eyes? And I went, excuse me? Can you raise your head and pull the cap up? Yeah. He goes, would you mind sitting down? I'd like to have a talk with you. And he knew it. He just said, are you ashamed to work for McDonald's? He goes, you can be open with me. And I said, well, yeah. I got friends who are coming through the drive-thru. They might know me. So, you're working. You got a great job. He goes, I tell you what, you have a dollar bill on you? Yeah? Well, I got one too. Let's exchange dollar bills. Okay, so he gave me a dollar bill. But I gave him one, and he'll look at it and go, you're just kind of old and dirty, but it's okay. And I'm thinking, well, you know, love you too. And I knew this. He goes, my name's John. I said, well, I'm Kenny. He goes, well, you mind going up there and get 2 cups of coffee? But you use your dollar for your coffee, and you use my dollar, you know, take both dollars and buy 2 cups of coffee. I thought this man was weird. He said, you come back, and I want you to take off the cap. Okay, he said, I have a story to tell. I came back, gave him the coffee. I had my coffee. And he goes, let me share something with you. Did you get the 2 coffee and nobody said anything? Uh-huh. But you had a dirty dollar bill and a beautiful dollar bill, a clean one. That was mine. Okay? So you see, I'm Black, you're white, and there's nothing to be ashamed, because I am actually the head director of 5 McDonald's as a janitor, and I'm checking on all the people who work here as custodians. I'm your boss. I said, I go get that little cap. I get the little one, you know, really small. He goes, you should never be ashamed where you work and who you are. He said, you're a pretty funny guy. I heard about you. I hear you work for Dollywood. Yeah, I'm a trick. And we just got to talking. And then, but the bar came out, and he saw the back of the guy that was, you know, that was African American. And he came over to me and said, can you be here for 30 minutes? I pointed to the African American guy. He goes, oh my God, oh, I didn't know that was you, John. Oh my God, I'm sorry. And he walked away. He goes, isn't that neat about the power I have over white people? I go, shut up. So it became really I loved it. So I got up, he got up and gave me to leave. And he said, give me a hug. And I go, great. So I gave him a hug. And so I went in there to my bar and said, give me back my freaking hat. And I made it smaller in the back. You can move it, you know. So I made it really small. And I saw some friends later that afternoon coming in, go, hey, y'all, how you doing? I hope to see you at church. And they're all going, you work here? Yes, I love it. You know what? I see the sunrise every morning. The God gave us the blessing of the sunrise coming over the mountain in Tennessee. So you see, I had a blessed job. And then I go straight to Dollywood and got to meet Dolly Parton. So I learned to appreciate, no matter where you work, appreciate it.
Absolutely love that story. And there's so much I could comment on that. We've got just a few minutes. I wish I could just talk more about it. Absolutely great. Thank you so much, Kenny. Paul, I wanted to ask you for your favorite story in the book. We have just a few more moments. Can you tell us what really struck you the most?
Yeah, I won't do it. I won't do it as well as Kenny, but I will tell you briefly. My favorite story is about Kenny when he was in the 3rd or 4th grade. Of course, he was kind of relegated to the back of the room because they didn't have a special class for kids with disabilities. So he was in the regular class with the regular kids, but they just made him sit in the back, and the teacher gave him a handful of crayons and some paper to color with. But they also had a psychiatrist that would come by once a month or so to evaluate the kids, especially the kids with special needs. And one of the ways he would evaluate them is by looking at their drawings. And so he would look at Kenny's drawings and would always give him like low scores because his drawings weren't very colorful or weren't very interesting. And so he thought that correlated with his mental capability. But it was really just because, the teacher had only given him 3 or 4 crayons. He had like a black, a white, and a red or something. That was it, And eventually, Kenny was sad about that. And one other teacher noticed him being sad and pulled him aside and asked him why. And he explained this. And she gave him one of those big, 64 packs of crayons like all the other kids have, and sent him off to draw something properly. And he did that. And the next time, of course, the psychiatrist came around. Kenny had this wonderful picture of a butterfly with all these colors and, gave him an A+. And it's just the lesson there is, don't look at people who have these different abilities as having less capability. Give them the same tools that you give anybody else, and you'll be amazed at what they'll accomplish. And again, that was a lesson, I think, for me personally, but also a lesson that I took into the office with me as well is, give everybody the same tools and they can probably accomplish some of the same things.
Paul, Kenny, we spoke about quite a few things on leadership, on stories, on adversity, on differences. And sometimes it's just in our head that we think we have an adversity when we don't, because we're better at something. Really good stories here. I know that this is very helpful to the entrepreneur world. You have to think about it because we all have what we have. We're all, as you mentioned, we have our superpower or our ability that makes us special. And if we use that and push that and work that, we can be successful and be grateful for what God has given us, because here we are, we're living, we're breathing, we're listening to this show, and we're learning. So that's all good. Gentlemen, I just want to say thank you so much. We discussed Lead with the Story with Paul Smith and Kenny Tedford, and you can find about the books and about both of these gentlemen at leadwithastory.com. Gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for sharing with us today. I really, truly appreciated it. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us on, Tony.
Hey, thanks for hanging out with me while I featured several elite entrepreneurs who took their vision to reality. We talked about Lead with the Story with Paul Smith and Kenny Tedford. And just for clarification, the book that Paul wrote for Kenny and with Kenny is called 4 Days with Kenny Tedford. And I chose the title here, Lead with the Story, because while it's one of Paul's books and while it's the website .com, it really hits and impacts all of us as entrepreneurs and gets us to better understand why a story is so important. As I mentioned at the very beginning of introduction of this interview, why is a story so important? And what I've learned myself is how we all have our adversity, or you could also put it in a positive note. We all have our abilities, what we're good at, what we're really good at, and what we excel at, and how we can use that ability to move forward, as well as bring on beings and people that have their abilities that help us with our company. And there's no such thing really as an adversity. Kenny Tedford, look at him. He's got a degree. This is amazing. He's made it. He's successful. He didn't sit back there on the couch and just say, oh, woe is me. He got up and he did something. He moved, he activated, he excelled, he pushed, he persevered. Absolutely amazing. The stories, I just absolutely love it. And I'm going to give this back to you and say, what resonated the most with you? What stories did you learn from Paul and Kenny? I'd love to know, so please tell me. And I really look forward to your listening to my shows. I really appreciate that you've tuned in. Please tune in again next week. We have great guests all the time. And if you have any Apple device, please consider giving a kind review on Apple Podcasts. That really means a lot to help grow the show. And of course, most important, I say this all the time, but not enough. Share this with a few friends because it's all about friends helping friends. All right? Use this and let's help you move on your journey to success. Thanks. Remember, just take action. Success awaits those who persevere and remain steadfast despite the odds. Sow good seeds. Do good deeds. And join me on the next episode of The Tony DUrso Show.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's edition of the Tony DUrso Show with his key influencers. Be sure to tune in again next Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, 2 p.m. Pacific Time on the Voice America Influencers channel.